Fairfax Cone inherited a great advertising agency from Albert Lasker, owner of the Lord and Thomas Agency established in Chicago in 1873. Together with his associates, Emerson Foote and Don Belding, and their successors, Cone led that agency through more than 30 years of growth and change, preserving the agency's greatness while giving it a new type of stature and keeping its headquarters in Chicago. Cone's period of leadership at Foote-Cone and Belding began at a time when the advertising industry was the subject of intense public criticism. Along with Leo Burnett, David Ogilvy, and a handful of others, Fairfax Cone led the industry's efforts to achieve socially responsible self-regulation. Fax, as he was called by his friends and colleagues, was born in San Francisco in 1903. His grandfather was an early settler there. His father was a mining engineer and a prospector. After high school, Cone went to sea for 8 months as a seaman on the SS Haxton, a transatlantic freighter. Following that, he continued his education at the University of California at Berkeley. Here he spent considerable time writing and drawing cartoons, finally developing a love for English literature. Though he had hoped to become an English teacher, on completing school, he got a job with the San Francisco Examiner, where he spent 3 years as a one-ad clerk, writer, and illustrator. It was here that Cone first learned some of the basic principles of advertising. Most importantly, that advertising is the language of business, that it is used to tell someone something of importance. It is a matter of being as direct and as simple as you can, of honest promises explained sensibly. In 1929, Cone moved to the San Francisco office of Lord and Thomas, at that time one of the largest advertising firms in the nation. Though the agency wanted to hire him as an artist, he insisted on being given a chance at copywriting. His request was granted, and he found the right kind of work at last, for he was a natural and gifted writer, and he loved the work. At Lord and Thomas, Cone was instilled with that agency's philosophy that advertising is salesmanship in print, and that it should provide a reason why it is in the consumer's best interest to buy the goods you have for sale. He also learned that each ad should be directed to an individual. He learned to write as he would speak, person to person. As a result, he developed the habit that was to stay with him for his lifetime, that he must write to a single person. When he felt that one of his fellow seamen on the SS Haxton would understand his ad and act on it, he knew instinctively that it was a good ad. Here, in his own voice, recorded late in his career, are the rules of good advertising developed by Fairfax Cone.
I believe the only reason one should use advertising is because he cannot talk in person, across a desk or a table or a back fence, with the best prospects for what he has to sell. As far as I'm concerned, advertising is the business of telling someone something that should be important to him. As I said, it's a substitute for talking to someone. It is the primary requirement, in my opinion, of advertising to be clear. Clear as to exactly what the proposition is. If it isn't clear, and clear at a glance or a whisper, very few people will take the time or make the effort to try to figure it out. The second essential of advertising is that what must be clear must also be important. The proposition must have value. Third of the requirements of good advertising is that the proposition, which is the promise, that is both clear and important, must also have a personal appeal. It should be beamed at its logical prospects. No one else matters. This is something that's forgotten in a great deal of advertising today, because in attempting to stop everyone, the directness of the appeal is often lost, and the advertising stops no one. Fourth, the distinction in good advertising expresses the personality of the advertiser. For a promise is only as good as its maker. I'm frequently reminded of this when I go down into the Loop in Chicago, past a restaurant that has chipped lettering on the window, some oilcloth inside alongside the grill that's been torn, an awning that is ragged and a large sign that says "World's Best Chili." Now, I just can't believe that a beat-up, ratty-looking restaurant like that could have the world's best anything. And it's a good example, I think, of what I mean when I say that a promise is only as good as its maker. Finally, a good advertisement demands action. It asks for an order, or it exacts a mental pledge. A desirable advertisement as one that will command attention but never be offensive. It will be reasonable but never dull. It will be original but never self-conscious. It will be imaginative but never misleading. And because of what it is and what it is not, a properly prepared advertisement will always be convincing, and it will make people act. If these points are adhered to, the advertising has to be honest. This, incidentally, is all that I know about advertising.
Among the accounts Cone wrote copy for in his early days at Lord & Thomas was the Southern Pacific Railroad. He said, quote, "Here I had all the West to write about, without limit to enthusiasm. Others were Sun-made raisins and various products for Safeway stores. His favorite, however, was writing for Californians Incorporated. Californians Incorporated was an association to promote tourism and bringing settlers to San Francisco and Northern California. Cone's ads invited people to visit as tourists, a place where they someday might want to live. The campaign ran for 8 years, and of every 100 people who came to the region as visitors, 10 remained or came back to live." Another of Cone's early successes was writing ads for the Dollar Steamship Line's round-the-world cruises. So that Cone would understand his product firsthand, the client sent Cone and his wife on a trip to the Orient. Cone's ads ran during the Great Depression of the 1930s, offering first-class round-the-world fare for less than $10 a day. The campaign was an outstanding success and became an advertising classic. In 1939, Fairfax Cone was made manager of the Lord & Thomas office in San Francisco. Soon thereafter, he had an experience, he said, influenced his entire business life. His first presentation for a new account was to the Carnation Milk Company. They were looking for a new agency for their subsidiary, the Albers Milling Company. After Cone finished, the head of their delegation said that Carnation liked to be the most important client of the people with whom they did their business. He said they were the most important to their attorneys, their bankers, their grain brokers, and their carton manufacturers, and they wanted to be the same to their new advertising agency. As Cone recalled, quote, "I took a very long, deep breath and told them, we aim to treat all clients alike. Then I named the entire list of San Francisco clients, and if there were any priorities, I said all of those would be ahead of Albers. However, I said, each, including Albers, gets everything we have to give. The gentlemen left, and I was sure that I had seen them for the last time. Much to my surprise, they returned a few days later and said they had asked a trick question to all the agencies they had talked to, and only ours gave the right answer. We were awarded the account." Cone summarized that experience as follows. "The thing is," he said, "all our clients must get the best we have, because we are in business for our clients first, and ourselves second. We can only be successful if our clients are. Moreover, our integrity can be no less than theirs." That's the way Fax Cone ran his business. The volume of the San Francisco office grew, and Cone began to receive letters of congratulations from the agency's owner, Albert Lasker. In March 1941, he met Mr. Lasker for the first time. Correspondence between the two became somewhat regular, and soon Cone realized that Lasker planned to induce him to move to the New York office of Lord & Thomas. That's exactly what happened in December 1941. In New York, Cone was assigned to work directly with the legendary George Washington Hill, whose Lucky Strike cigarette advertising accounted for a large share of Lord & Thomas's billings.
American. Certain facts must be plain to every smoker. It takes fine tobacco to make a fine cigarette, and Lucky Strike means fine tobacco.
Cone was instrumental in making several improvements in the Lucky Strike advertising.
LSMFT, LSMFT, LSMFT. There's fine smoking pleasure in fine tobacco, and Lucky Strike means fine tobacco. So round, so firm, so fully packed, so free and easy on the draw.
The famous LSMFT series of ads and radio commercials include some of Cone's suggestions. In 1942, Lasker moved Cone again, this time to Lord & Thomas's Chicago office to take charge of all creative effort there. In October of that same year, Cone was appointed manager of the Chicago office. Only 3 months after assuming the top job in the Chicago office, Fairfax Cone and Don Belding, manager of Lord & Thomas's West Coast office, were summoned to New York. There, they and Emerson Foote, who managed Lord & Thomas in New York, met with Albert Lasker. Lasker informed the three men he had decided to retire from the advertising business, and that in order to make the retirement final, he was liquidating Lord & Thomas and retiring its name as well. However, he hoped that Messrs. Foote, Cone, and Belding would take over his domestic business. Lasker recommended that Belding be chairman of the board, Foote be president, and Cone be chairman of the executive committee. On December 29, 1942, the papers were signed. The new agency, Foote, Cone, and Belding, began business in January 1943 with $22.5 million in billings. For the next decade, Fairfax Cone, Don Belding, and Emerson Foote ran the agency as a team. In 1952, Emerson Foote retired from the firm due to illness. He later regained his health and returned to advertising as president and board chairman of McCann Erickson. In 1959, Don Belding retired at the age of 60 to devote his time to various public affairs. New men replaced Foote and Belding in the management of the agency. But until 1970, when he retired, Fax Cone continued to be the creative director and the leader in the management of Foote Cone and Belding. He continued on the board of directors until 1975, when he was named Director Emeritus and Founder Chairman. Fairfax Cone's amazing longevity in the business can be attributed to his interest and concern with the professionalization of advertising and the sheer pleasure he derived from the act of product presentation. Throughout his decades of agency leadership, he kept himself actively engaged in developing new campaigns. Foote Cone and Belding's successes under Cone's leadership were many. Its first new account involved a radio show for Campbell's Soup starring comedian Jack Carson. Then came Imperial for Hiram Walker, and later Walker's Deluxe. In 1943, FCB's Los Angeles office was appointed the task force agency for the forest fire prevention campaign, symbolized by Smokey the Bear. Now, more than 30 years later, the agency is still producing this advertising. It has been cited as one of the major public service advertising campaigns. In 1944, Fairfax Cone met Joyce C. Hall, president of Hallmark Cards Incorporated, and acquired an account which has proved to be one of the outstanding advertising successes of our generation. Working hand in hand, Cone and Hall built a personality for Hallmark by combining the Hallmark Hall of Fame radio and television programs with the phrase, "When you care enough to send the very best." In 1951, Hallmark presented the first televised opera to the nation, and in 1953, television's first 2-hour dramatic show, Shakespeare's Hamlet, starring Maurice Evans. The New York Times reported, "The number of persons who saw Hamlet undoubtedly exceeded all others who have seen the play since it was written." The Chicago Tribune added, "It was television's shining hour." Other Shakespearean plays followed. Over 100 Hallmark Hall of Fame programs in all, and they won more Emmys than any other TV program. In 1961, Joyce C. Hall became the first sponsor ever awarded an Emmy. Pictured here, on the left, is Mr. Hall and his Emmy with Fax Cone. In 1946, Tony Home Permanent came to Cone's agency. A year later, the Which Twin Has the Tony campaign made its appearance in magazines and became one of advertising's most successful campaigns. It demonstrated at a glance, with a side-by-side comparison, that a $2 Tony gave a permanent wave that couldn't be distinguished from an expensive beauty shop permanent. Tony was a product which fulfilled a definite need, and sales responded accordingly. The advertising theme caught on with the public to such an extent that it was quoted in cartoons, on stage, screen, TV, and radio. Another example of success guided by Fairfax Cone was the Dial soap campaign. An Armor product, Dial was unique in its use of a chemical that killed odor-causing bacteria. This became the basic message used in the initial advertising. Armor had an innovative new product in a market dominated by three giant soapers, Procter & Gamble, Colgate-Palmolive, and Lever Brothers. The key to success was a good product plus an outstanding advertising campaign. A team led by Cone developed the campaign. Introduced in 1948, the advertising strategy for Dial was so sound that it was used for over 15 years. By 1961, Dial had become the leading toilet soap on the market. The theme, "Aren't You Glad You Used Dial?" was initiated in 1952. There were other outstanding campaigns. Among Cone's favorites were Kool-Aid, Zenith, Raid, and Clear. In each of these cases, Fairfax Cone was involved in heading a team that developed a highly successful advertising campaign. There was also a famous failure, the Edsel. This automobile received a huge advertising budget, and the ads were well done. But the public's automobile preferences had changed while the Edsel was under development, and the advertising was unable to move the product. Fairfax Cone liked to cite this case as evidence that no amount of advertising can sell a product that does not offer basic values to the consumer. A few more campaigns deserve special mention. One is Pepsodent. On radio, Pepsodent's development of Bob Hope as a leading comedian of our time remains a monument to advertising. This radio excerpt will bring back memories.
The Pepsodent Show, starring Bob Hope. Oh, every town you know, your girlfriend or your beau, strike up the band. Bob Hope's the man who ties the can to woe. Ah, thank you so much. How do you do, ladies and gentlemen? This is Bob Hope back once again to tell you it's better to have Pepsodent flowing over your teeth now than to have water running under your bridge later.
Hope was on the air for Pepsodent from 1938 to 1948. Some years later, in 1955, Pepsodent returned to radio and actually helped revive a medium almost forgotten.
You'll wonder where the yellow went when you brush your teeth with Pepsodent. You'll wonder where the yellow went when you brush your teeth with Pepsodent.
Pepsodent's Yellow Went campaign was broadcast more than 200 times a week, coast to coast. As a result, Pepsodent's share of the market increased 50%. Another FCB classic was Clairol. The theme, "Does she or doesn't she? Only her hairdresser knows for sure," was a key factor in popularizing hair coloring, a product which had been suspect for many years. As a result, it led the way to changing the grooming habits of millions of women, transforming a business which in 1955 sold to less than 8% of women to a more than $250 million per year industry. Sun-Kissed Oranges represented one of Cone's favorite advertising campaigns. Sun-Kissed has been continually served by Lord & Thomas and Foote-Cone and Belding since 1907. Cone felt that of all the products advertised, Sun-Kissed Oranges benefited the public most. Fairfax Cone was not only a good practitioner of advertising, he was a good teacher, and he trained his people well. In everything he wrote, in all of the advertising he supervised and approved, he stuck to his principles of what good advertising must be. Good advertising, he would say, always comes as close as it can to a face-to-face confrontation of the prospective purchaser of a product by the product's maker. Perhaps most important is this: the mass audience is made up of individuals, and good advertising is written always from one person to another. When it is aimed at millions, it rarely moves anyone. He believed with all his heart that the honesty of advertising came from the advertising itself. Punishment for sinning, he said, is swift and sure. It comes from a public that deeply resents being fooled and will not buy any new product that has failed to live up to its original advertising promise. Fairfax Cone's years of leadership at Foote Cone and Belding brought dignified success to the agency. Cone, Don Belding, and Emerson Foote went into business determined to adhere to certain ethical principles, even if doing so meant the loss of accounts. To quote Cone, "We believe that advertising should be thoughtful and honest, with no exceptions, and that no other kind should ever play a part in the affairs of Foote Cone and Belding." At the same time, Fairfax Cone became a civic leader in Chicago and devoted much of his time to community affairs, especially to education. He was a member of Chicago's Board of Education for 3 years and served as a trustee, and then as chairman of the Board of Trustees of the University of Chicago. Nevertheless, he always found time to keep the pledge he made to his associates when Foote Cone and Belding was born, that he would work diligently to raise the stature of advertising. To that end, he served as a director of the Advertising Council and the Advertising Federation of America. He was especially active in the 4A's, the American Association of Advertising Agencies, both as a lifetime director and as its chairman. For years, he led the industry in its efforts to make advertising respected. Cone wrote a good deal on the subject. He traveled across the country making speeches about what was wrong with advertising, how it should be corrected, and what was right with advertising. Often he emphasized that the principal challenge to advertising people everywhere is to move toward professional status. Technically, this may be something they can never achieve, but they can observe professional rules and they can maintain professional standards. In 1969, in a book titled With All Its Faults, a candid account of 40 years in advertising, Cone described his long and distinguished career in the world he led and loved. The Blue Streak, published in 1973, is a selection of Cone's famous Blue Streak memos written to the Foote Cone and Belding staff between 1948 and 1969. Cone wrote more than 1,000 such memos, relating in very person-to-person language his thoughts and observations not only on advertising, but on people, events, and life in general. Fairfax M. Cone died of a heart ailment in June 1977 at the age of 74. Above all, Fax Cone practiced his beliefs in his own business life. Through his example and through his preaching, he helped an important industry make itself socially responsible and socially respectable. In 1975, Cone was elected to the American Advertising Federation's Advertising Hall of Fame, the industry's highest honor. In 1976, he was named to the Illinois Business Hall of Fame. Time magazine once called Cone the advertising industry's most respected scold. A competitor stated, "The advertising game is not without its statesmen, and Fairfax Cone is one of them." Another of his contemporaries referred to him as the Abe Lincoln of advertising. Advertising Age magazine referred to him as one of the true giants of the 20th century advertising world. Fairfax M. Cone was all of those.